All right, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. We're just doing a last minute live here to do some coverage on the massive protest that took place in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, this morning, as well as other cities across the country. I have with me an old friend, Nebiyu Asfaw, to go over some of the analysis with me. Looks like I'm echoing again, Nebi. I don't know if there's anything new, but we'll see. If we are echoing, let me know. We're trying something new here today. And so I was a little bit taken aback by how massive the protests were. As many of you know, this morning or earlier today, there was a private UN Security Council meeting about the conflict in Ethiopia. They came out with no resolutions, specifically because China and Russia vetoed it. But the general consensus among many Ethiopians and Eritreans has been that the West, and the US in particular, has been an unreliable broker of peace in this conflict in Ethiopia, and often appears to be taking the side or doing things that favors the armed insurgents who were part of the previous brutal government that were sidelined in 2018 and started a war apparently to try to get back into power. So the general consensus has been on the ground and then diaspora. If there's one thing that Ethiopians and Eritreans have a consensus on, is that the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, that was in power between 1991 and 2018, can no longer come back into the equation, the political equation, particularly because they started a war in 2020 as opposed to trying to work with what is now the new government, Abiy Ahmed's prosperity government. So these protests appear to be timely, as on Monday there are supposed to be peace talks, African Union led, at least they're supposed to be African Union led peace talks. So it appears that the people on the ground in Ethiopia are sending a message to the West. In fact, some of the signs that they were holding up was saying no to US intervention, no to intervening in the name of humanitarian aid, respect Ethiopia's sovereignty, no two parallel armed groups in one country. So signs like that. So Nebiyu, I'm curious, what you thought of what you saw. We heard that there were going to be protests just in the last week alone. But were you surprised to find that the crowd looked very much like it did when we did the No More rallies last November?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Hermela. I was really pleasantly surprised by the magnitude of this rally protest that happened in Addis Ababa, considering that it was something that was put together in a short amount of time. And it really shows the frustration of the Ethiopian people that they've had enough. They've had enough. And just when, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Africans are feeling that a new dawn is coming, and that the era of the TPLF is coming to an end. There has been a barrage of just propaganda and fear mongering and just misinformation just happening, that's just really upsetting people. And we know the truth, and we have to speak up. Just within the past few days, I mean, they've been saying like the fabric of Ethiopia is falling apart. Things are getting out of control, from the United Nations to the State Department, from the U.S. ambassador to the UN, the Human Rights Watch calling for sanctions on Ethiopia, all in a matter of days. The UN Security Council holding a session, and it's just tiring. And if you look at all the news the last 2 days, the genocide narrative is coming back suddenly. I mean, it's all out, and it's so predictable. And for those of us who've been following this, it's infuriating. And I think that's what really fired up such a crowd. I mean, I think that was in the hundreds of thousands out at Mescal Square in Addis. It's just really magnificent.
Absolutely. And there was at least one other protest in the country. I saw pictures from Hawassa, which is, I believe, in the South, which is also really quite big, especially for a last minute turnaround. It is I think sending a clear message that there is no negotiating with the TPLF. I think one of the issues that is a concern of all Ethiopians, Eritreans, and many people of the Horn is the worry that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government may actually acquiesce to the West and bend to the concessions that they're looking the Ethiopian government to make, which aren't very clear. But it's I think easy to speculate that they want the TPLF to have some sort of leverage, possibly to have a position in the new government, which I think 2 years into the war makes that less likely. Although the country has been through a lot diplomatically, it's been kind of dragged through the mud. It's gone through a lot of financial constraints because of the conflict. But I think what these protests tell me is Ethiopians understand that they may have to pay a price for their sovereignty, that it's not going to be easy, but they are going to continue to speak up and push back and let the West know that they cannot continue to ask for concessions from the Ethiopian government for this armed group. In no other world, including right here in the United States, would that be an acceptable request that you make of a government. What are you sending, or what message are you sending to the world, to the country, to those here in the United States, when you're essentially saying if you pick up a gun and attack National Army Defense Forces and also kill civilians and pillage and loot, that you will actually be able to get a seat at the table? I think that's the bottom line, particularly for those outside of Ethiopia and Eritrea who don't necessarily have a sentimental connection to the TPLF, a bad connection, a negative sentimental emotion, or rather a negative emotion to the TPLF. I think one thing that we need to continue to make clear is that these aren't just little old rebels or a rebel group from an ethnic minority. This is the old guard. This was a group that was in power for 27 years. This was a group that had roughly 80% of the armament, which is why they thought they could start this war and actually win it against the will of the vast majority of the 120 million people in Ethiopia. I want to talk a little bit about, the concerns that, this government may actually bend to the pressures of the West. I think it's the one thing, Nebiyu, that it really unites people of all backgrounds, of all political leanings. The vast majority of people in Ethiopia with all backgrounds, or from all backgrounds and political leanings. And there's a reason that folks are fearful of that. First of all, they understand the power that the West, has in terms of financial bullying, but they also understood how far the TPLF and its followers are willing to go, whether they're forced to do it or brainwashed into doing it, to put pressure on the government. And we did see those releases happen in January with a few top TPLF leadership and others that really upset people, largely because I think it blindsided them, and they thought it may be an indication that the Ethiopian government would in fact bend to the West. So can you speak a little bit about those fears, and have you seen any indications that maybe just in fact Ethiopia is going strongly in the direction of sovereignty and is not going to bend to the West the way that the US would like it to?
No, absolutely. That fear that people have, that is very valid, because this is the third attack by the TPLF. This is the third wave. And at least for the last two waves, there was some concessions made by the Ethiopian government to give peace a chance, but to what essentially was really giving in, or giving concessions to the demands of the West. There's been multiple attempts, threats of sanctions. There's been even threats of military intervention back last year, if you recall, that really triggered our global movement. And consistently, there's been threat after threat after threat, where it appeared that the Ethiopian government was giving in, conceding, and instead of you know um, using that opportunity to work with Ethiopia, to work with Africa, and bringing peace, the response from the West has been more and more and more. What became very clear is that the intention is to bring back the TPLF to power, to restore this group back into power on the Ethiopian people. This is not about the people of Tigray. No one is suffering more than the people of Tigray. And this is really at the moment of liberation, fighting to liberate the people of Tigray. But um, you remember last year with all the release of prisoners, the TPLF, that wasn't enough. There was the counteroffense where the Ethiopian government stopped at the border of Tigray, not went further. That wasn't enough. The TPLF came back, wreaked havoc in the Afar region and the Amhara region, almost apparently, got closer to Addis. All that destruction, thousands of lives lost, suffered. That wasn't enough. I think, though, what's different now is the tone of the government of Ethiopia from what we hear is more sound and more stable, as in we are going to protect the sovereignty of Ethiopia. And for the past 6 months before this last third wave started, remember, there was peace talks. And it was TPLF that walked out of this peace talk. In fact, to the dismay of many of us and many Ethiopians, the Ethiopian government gave too much chance. Time again, they've come back with more hostility. But I think this time, it looks like um, you know, they're going to go all the way. And I will say this much: if they don't end the war by ending the TPLF or disarming the TPLF this time, I don't know when that time will come. The suffering will continue, the war will continue, and this is the time. And the rally in Addis Ababa shows that the people are behind this decision. And Ethiopia is not just any run of the mill country that can be pushed around. And maybe a poor country, but it's a country of 120 million people and a very important part of the world. And I don't think that it could just simply be pushed around if we stay united. And I think the moment has come when not just Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Horn of Africa, that all of Africa once again comes together to resist this hostility.
Absolutely. I think people are saying enough is enough. No more to this pattern of pretending to care about the people and pretending to be interested in a country's conflict because of humanitarian aid. And in fact, watching that humanitarian aid get stolen by the TPLF rebels before they go on offensives, including last September, a total of about 1,000 United Nations humanitarian aid trucks that were quote unquote stolen or just went missing, didn't come back after going into Tigray, when what was supposed to happen was they were supposed to return to their bases so that they could take more aid to civilians in the Tigray region. There was never any accountability for the United Nations allowing those 1,000 trucks to go into Tigray, never return. And we know the head of the United Nations World Health Organization is a known TPLF executive member and is implicated by UN employees, one of whom were fired for actually speaking out and saying that he was circumventing the humanitarian aid process to help the rebels. So that there was no accountability there. There was no accountability when we saw the World Food Program actually blow the whistle this time and say that 500,000 liters of fuel were stolen by TPLF rebels. But it's not enough for them to say that this happened. They are responsible when they're going in as these NGOs, USAID or World Food Program. They need to be responsible for making sure that this aid is used for the purpose of civilians as they say it's intended to, and not letting it go to rebels and people who have picked up arms against an elected government. And we see time and time again, even if they actually acknowledge it like they did with the World Food Program's fuel in August, there's no accountability. They revert back to this both sidesism that the Ethiopian government needs to bring peace, particularly, and I think you touched on this, particularly when the Ethiopian government appears to be advancing, like it appears to to be doing in this last response or defensive measure after the TPLF went on the offensive on August 24th. They're now capturing several key cities in Tigray, and it appears the rhetoric from the West, from the UN, from the State Department, from the U.S. ambassador to the UN, always ramps up at a time when the Ethiopian government is on the defensive and potentially a strong defensive, when the TPLF is going on offensive, particularly after the U.S. Horn Envoy visited Tigray, took pictures, way too friendly of pictures for an ambassador and for a Horn Envoy, taking selfies with top TPLF leadership, and then just days, I believe it was, possibly a week or two after he returns from Tigray, the TPLF goes on offensive. He said nothing to us then, and he actually his office met with some pro-Ethiopia Ethiopia unity representatives, and we were in that meeting, and it was really bothersome that there wasn't a strong condemnation of the TPLF's offensive, and instead going back to the both sidesism, and never in that meeting or anywhere else up until very recently did the Horn Envoy Ambassador Mike Hammer say what he said very recently, which is, when I was in Tigray, it was clear that the TPLF was preparing for an offensive. That is not what he said after the trip. What he did after the trip is come back with preconditions that the TPLF decided that it was going to put in place for talks as it relates to returning basic services like telecom and electricity. That is something the Ethiopian government responded and said, we will do this, but we need a guarantee, a written guarantee of a cessation of hostilities, and we need to make sure the utility workers that we send into this region are going to come back alive, because many were killed during a time before June 2021, when the Ethiopian government was in control of its Tigray region. There were some utility workers, I believe it was dozens of utility workers, definitely more than a dozen, that were killed on the job. And so it is only just a basic reasonable measure on the part of the Ethiopian government to ask for the protection and the guaranteed protection of these utility workers. Who's going to go into this, terrorist or insurgent occupied region to turn on the services for people if they cannot be guaranteed to come back alive? And so it was very disappointing to find out after the fact, when things were ramping up as far as the war, that Ambassador Hammer then admits, when he knew that they were going to go on the offensive, that would have been something to share, as opposed to coming back with what the TPLF decided it needed to have to come to the table. And you also touched on this as well. This is the third TPLF offensive, and before the last one, the Ethiopian government for months was saying, we are willing to come to the table without any preconditions, and that was at a time of peace. That means during a time of peace, they would come to the table without requesting anything to get to the table. So I think, to your point, Nebiyu, they really the protest out there today, I think, shows the frustration of the people, and I don't even know that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has the mandate to stop this war, to do anything but finish the TPLF. There cannot be two armed groups in one country. Sovereignty has to be protected. So, that's something. Do you think that is a message that is being watched by the State Department, regardless of the fact whether mainstream media is covering it or not? I think the mass showing of this sends that signal before the peace talks.
Yeah, 100%. The State Department, the United Nations, and all the European Union, even Canada, they're not even hiding it anymore. They're not hiding it anymore. And everything you said is 100% accurate. On top of that, this week, when the TPLF is close to what appears to be its deathbed, they're just ramping up all the allegations. Iran is selling drones to Ethiopia. I mean, they're just digging up as much crap as they can to pull in. Again, it's to pressure the Ethiopian government, it's to pressure the prime minister. And I do say that, the Ethiopian government, the prime minister, has been given the grace of the Ethiopian people, not once, not twice, three times. And I don't think there's any more grace to tolerate any more TPLF. When there's an opportunity at hand, when the TPLF is at its weakest, when its army is falling apart, when it's on the run, when forces of the TPLF are putting down their arms and running, you know, we've seen this before, where for the sake of, you know, pressure from the international community, where the Ethiopian government stopped. This is not an offense by the Ethiopian government. This is a defense. The Ethiopian government, the Amhara Special Forces, Fano, and Eritrea defending itself, all of these allied forces have sacrificed so much. And people in Tigray, people in Amhara and Afar have sacrificed so much. How much more can people take? How much more is okay? How many more lives? I mean, how many more lives is okay to lose just to appease the West? Entities that we have seen over a period of 2 years that cannot be appeased, right? And we know this from history. We've seen this again and again and again in multiple countries throughout Africa, Latin America. You know, there's this imperialistic tendencies where you bully countries into compliance or you destroy them, you know, in one way or another. And this is a form of a proxy war with the TPLF. It's an attack on the people. And if the Ethiopian government does not stand up and fulfill its mandate of securing the safety and the security of the people of Ethiopia, the people of Tigray, it will become a failure. I mean, that's it. I think we have reached. This is the moment of truth. This is the moment of truth. Um, you know, everything that could possibly be tried to end to bring the TPLF to accept peace has failed. They've made it crystal clear by their action that they don't want peace. All they want is to come back to power at any cost, right? Um, how is it possible that this entity, the TPLF, is stealing aid and hoarding aid, starving the people, and turning around and crying victim with and the world, the West is cheering that on, and this has become crystal clear to the Ethiopian people. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Right, and I think that's where we are. That's where the people of Ethiopia are, and today's massive historic demonstration and Ethiopia shows that the people have had enough. And not only is this a statement to those that are pulling the strings of the TPLF, not only is it a statement to them, it's a statement to the Ethiopian government that finished the job, right? Um, you know, there's if there's any peace talk, and I know there is an arrangement with the African Union, I think it's Monday. You know, Hermela, if there's any peace talk at this point, it has to be a peace talk to negotiate the exile of the TPLF ringleaders, if we are willing to give them that grace. I mean, ideally, they should face justice. But if they're willing to leave the country and the TPLF is to disarm, I think Ethiopians might be okay with that, for the sake of peace. But you know, anything short of a disarmament of this savage group, that has really, not just the last 2 years, the last 30 years and the last 40 years on the people of Tigray. This tyrants. I mean, how long is enough? 40 years, 30 years is not enough. They want to come back more. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So I think the statement has been made today by the people of Ethiopia, both for the Western nations that are pulling the strings for the TPLF, and for the Ethiopian government and its allied forces, that it's time. It's time to end this war by disarming the TPLF terror group.
Absolutely. And I think your point about sacrifice is really poignant. I want to touch on that. And I want to talk a little bit more about the peace talks, because we're getting a couple of questions on that. Ethiopians and Eritreans and some Somalis, I believe, have sacrificed a lot in this conflict, right? It is a conflict that concerns their countries. It is a conflict that threatens the sovereignty of their countries. And a lot of people, both soldiers and civilians, have been martyred in this conflict. So, some of these State Department officials or Congress people may think that we, the ones in the diaspora, are the ones who are deciding the fate of Ethiopia. But in fact, it is the people on the ground, those who have actually sacrificed lives of the people and their family members and their neighbors. It has been a very difficult for 2 months for much of the country, particularly those in Amhara and Afar regions, as well as the Oromia regions that have been tangentially affected, as well as the people in Tigray who were walked into a war that they did not understand what exactly they were walking into. And we've heard in the last year that many were no longer willing to go fight for the TPLF. They were being forced to fight, that parents were being told, if you don't send a kid, you're not going to get grain. We actually saw an interview on I believe it was EMS, one of the channels in Ethiopia, where they were interviewing a father in an area of Tigray that had been liberated by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. And he said they told me that if I wanted aid, that I would have to send my son. And I said, I'm not trading my son for grain. But his son, he didn't know where his son was, because the assumption was his son, ran away to avoid being conscripted. In fact, I've heard personally family members who've heard from those that have escaped to, not my family members, but from people who have family members in Tigray who have ran to major cities in order to avoid being conscripted and hiding, because they know, by the way the TPLF operates, they're not going to get the proper training to fight. They know this is no longer a cause that they can get behind. Many of them, who are smart enough to be able to see through that, or at least have access or exposure to other media or people that see things differently. They know that if they go, they are not coming back. We've heard that TPLF and leaked audio recordings from one of the generals uses human wave tactics. In fact, this is not new. Under the TPLF-led EPRDF leadership, human wave tactics were exactly how they fought wars, where they pushed the youngest, the least trained into the front, and then saved their more experienced soldiers in the back. And so that, when we listen to that audio recording of the general commanding one of his troops to fight, or to shoot rather, those who were trying to retreat from the battlefield, saying, let them know there's a bullet waiting for them here, so they better keep going. So if they're fearing death and that's why they're returning, well, death is awaiting them here too. I mean, these are things that will not go away. These are truths that will remain, and Ethiopian media and the Ethiopian government has to do a better job of getting them out there, although it's all over social media. And we know we cannot continue to give the State Department or those in Congress the pass of ignorance. The information is out there. The World Food Program is telling you that these rebels are stolen 500,000 liters of fuel. I mean, that is fuel to run over 1,000 trucks, possibly 2,000, if my math serves me correctly. So these are really a huge amount of resources that are being stolen by an armed group in a country that has an elected government. And I think you also touched on this about Tigray. Really, this is not good for Tigray. They need to disarm. They need to be disarmed as part of the peace talks. I think it's a really difficult ask of the people of Tigray to themselves defeat the TPLF and to be able to get out of their grips. It has to be something that is negotiated by the brokers, the AU-led negotiation. So I want to talk a little bit actually, let me touch, and I guess this actually goes into the peace talks as well. This idea of the TPLF leadership going into exile. I think Ethiopians and Eritreans have gone up and down about this. At some point, there was a sense that, you know what, fine, let these people go into exile if it means that this war will end. But another perspective on this is, as time goes on, if they do not negotiate leaving the country right now, and if they continue to drag this country through a war, then the idea of an exile and amnesty seems to just get further and further away from a realistic ask of the people. So we have Binyam who wants to know, what can we expect from the peace talks? I've got some ideas, but I want to hear what you think, Nebiyu. And then Kinde said something, wants to ask along those lines too. How do you think this war will end? Do you think the peace deal is really going to happen as planned? How TPLF is going to represent their demons, as he calls them. So I'll leave that longer question up on screen so you can refer to it. But the viewer before, Binyam, said, what can be expected from the peace talks?
Well, if history is a lesson, what can be expected from a peace talk is TPLF to use it as an opportunity to drag its feet, to bring about a truce or some sort of a ceasefire, so they can refuel, so they can plunder more aid, so they can regroup and come back. I would guarantee you that's what the TPLF would want, and that's what its enablers would let it do. So if the Ethiopian government falls for that again, they would negotiate, they would ceasefire, silence the guns, and then next thing you know, humanitarian corridor must be opened, and then they get their supplies again. Another 3-4 months, they come back and attack. They're going to do this over and over and over again until they come back to power. So that cannot be allowed to happen. But what could happen is, there's another favorite phrase, like it's like, the what one the old song hits coming back again, right? No military solution. That's back again. Now they're saying that no military solution because they know there's a military solution at hand. We're on the cusp of one, and I think that um, if the Ethiopian government and allied forces show the determination that they have the upper hand and they have the backing of the Ethiopian people, that the TPLF does not have much more options, and that it could be forced into negotiating into a disarmament, putting down their arm. You know, and if they don't, there has to be a real and tangible option that the government would follow through of disarming them by force. Um, but we don't. One thing that's different now that the old scenarios may not work for the TPLF, that may actually enable peace, is that the people of Tigray are sick and tired of the TPLF. And they've showed this over the past few months by fleeing Tigray, by speaking out. Even some of their own journalists in Makale have been criticizing them, that have been arrested. You know, even for criticizing them, the TPLF for sitting in their mansions with electricity while people are in the dark, or hospitals didn't have light. So that shows you that people are sick of them. And we're witnessing video footage coming out of some areas that in Tigray that are being liberated, where people are celebrating, despite the notion and this disinformation that the Ethiopian government is attacking civilians. Civilians are welcoming them, right? So I think all the cards are now favoring the Ethiopian forces, which would put it in a very strong position to perhaps in this peace deal, if it's a deal, is for the TPLF to no longer become a political or an armed entity. You know, amnesty is hard to swallow, but that could be one thing that comes out of it in the form of the top leaders going into exile, and the rank and files being disarmed. I think that's one real scenario that the TPLF may be forced into accepting. And just like back in '91 when the TPLF came to power, remember Mengistu Haile Mariam was forced into exile, and it was like, if you don't go into exile, the war is gonna come into Addis Ababa, people will die. So he left. The same situation may happen where they would leave the country and the rest of the TPLF disarms. Um, that's what I think would happen. Otherwise, we're going to be back to zero. The cycle that we've been witnessing the last 2 years, three different times.
Absolutely. I mean, I tend to agree with you because I'm looking at the same precedent as you are. I mean, we've seen the same pattern over and over again when the TPLF is in a position to actually do something that is sober and move towards peace talks. They tend to come up with these completely outrageous demands that an armed group that has started a war in a country by killing National Army Defense Forces would not even have the audacity to ask for if it did not have the West and if it did not have the UN and the EU and diplomatic cover and all of its friends that they made in the 27 years of power, using the billions of dollars they are alleged to have stolen from development money for Ethiopia. It is clear that this isn't a poor ragtag group, because as bad as their narrative is, as many holes that there are in it, we are fighting night and day with so-called news outlets that continue to ignore the glaring facts about who the TPLF is now, who they have been since their inception. In fact, in 1975, when they were rebels that took up arms against the communist government at the time and fought for 17 years and were U.S. backed to overthrow that government. And I think one of the things that is just important to note is this is one of many opposition groups at the time. They were U.S. backed when they came into power, so they didn't unilaterally overthrow the communist government. There was a lot of efforts. The communist experiment, as it was done then, was not. Was getting bloody. Countries around the world were moving away from that experiment, and so it was just almost happenstance that a bunch of things lined up for them to get into power, and it was an incredible opportunity for them to run a country properly. But instead, what many of them did is loot the country of its resources and kept much of Ethiopia as poor as it was 20 plus years ago. I mean, they like to brag about the development and the GDP, but the GDP, first of all, is not an indication of how people on the ground live. And when you look at the country, only the really Addis Ababa and a few other cities look like cities at all. But much of the rest of the country is very rural. People don't have clinics within hours of where they live. I mean, there's the quality of life is very low for many Ethiopians. It does not match the perceptions that the West and the mainstream media tried to create for the TPLF-led EPRDF era between 1991 and 2018. So, I agree with you. They do not make sense even for themselves. And I think it's because they believe that they are, truly a superpower. And that is why they were able to get to the top of government in 1991. Never mind the fact that they were US backed and there were so many other things that lined up for them. And so I think they take that same sort of lack of context into the present day. They do not take into consideration that right now, in 2022, they are a known entity for Ethiopians and Eritreans. They've been around since 1991. And so they can no longer pretend to be something that the people know that, they are, or pretend not to be something that the people know that they are. So they're acting as if this 1991, and they're trying to replay that. And so when they do come to the table, assuming the peace talks go through on Monday, I believe they're going to come with outrageous demands that do not reflect the lack of leverage they have right now, because as you mentioned, it appears that the Ethiopian government has an upper hand on the military front. And so then what happens next? They come to the table with these insane demands similar to they have every time there's a possibility of peace talks. I remember in the first year after the June ceasefire, they came with these preconditions rather, saying, they wanted all services restored, a bunch of things. But one of the ones that I thought was, wow, like this is really beyond reality, is they asked to see the budget for the next fiscal year as if they were a part of the government, and had the privilege and the access to be able to be given a budget after they had started an insurgency war. And so I do expect to see that, which is unfortunate for everybody that's in the area where the conflict is in place. But I also tend to agree with you that the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian National Defense Forces are in a stronger place than they were when they were sort of surprise attack in November 2020. I think there were some preparations to strengthen the army, because it was clear that the army didn't serve the Ethiopian people or the country, that it was much of the army was still in the security apparatus was still supporting and loyal to the Tigray People's Liberation Front. But it's 2 years later now. There's a 5-month ceasefire where it looks like the Ethiopian government was really preparing and recruiting and training. And so unfortunately, I do think we're going to see much of the same. And then I think from the TPLF, and I also think we're going to see much of the same from Western powers as well. I want to talk a little bit about the journey that many of us in the diaspora and those on the ground have gone through. It has been an up and down journey, but I think we continue to move forward. We continue to find ways to work together. How do you see where we are as a community, both in the diaspora and on the ground in this moment?
United. I think that it's very clear, the consensus within the Ethiopian community is that the TPLF must go. And I've noticed that when the Ethiopian government is more decisive when it comes to the TPLF, when the Ethiopian government is more protective of the sovereignty of the country, and listens to the people's demand, uh, more unity emerges within the people. The unity fractures when there's appeasement. Listen, Ethiopia is a historic country. Ethiopia is an ancient country and a very proud people. We always talk about, African liberation, Ethiopia being resisting colonialism and defeating Western European aggression. This is something Ethiopians take pride on. And in this time of the internet, and this time of uh, instant communication, and they're witnessing, Western nations corroborating with this entity, really to break up Ethiopia. And Hermela, you gave a really good historic reminder of how the TPLF came about and how it came into power, served as a proxy. And let's not forget, we're in this situation where people are fighting over tribe and ethnicity because of the TPLF, because it instituted this unheard of ethnic politics where your identity was weaponized, and that your identity became your politics. And that was what they used to divide the nation so they can rule unopposed for 3 decades. You know what this reminds me of? Where this playbook came from? Colonialism. That's what the colonialists did. They divided people amongst tribes, and they say, you're this, you're that, you're this. So and so is better than you. So and so's grandparents did this to you. Blah blah blah. That's how they divided Africa. That's how they started a million civil wars, coups, and destruction. So they would colonize the continent for almost 400 years, you know, and that's the same game that TPLF deployed. Um, so, um, but I think that's over. And for the Ethiopian people who see through this game, who see through this proxy war, who see through this covert and overt disinformation, it's infuriating. And it touches a nerve. It brings up that Adwa spirit that we're under attack again. And when we're under attack by foreign entities, our differences are put aside, completely put aside. You know what I mean? So I think that we're approaching that moment. I think that's where we are. I know there's a protest being organized in Washington, D.C., and maybe in other places this weekend, and that people are going to speak up. But that's also very, very important. One thing that we're really lucky for Ethiopians and Eritreans, particularly, is that we have a large diaspora that are American citizens that live in the West that have the freedom to speak, that have the freedom to counter this false narrative, because it's very important to do that. Unless we do that, unless we counter that, unless we tell the truth to the American people through by through our own means, just from talking to your neighbor, talking to your coworker, to advocating on social media or protesting, whatever it takes. Awaken the American people that your government is back at it again on another regime change proxy war. The American people are sick and tired of this. And unless we speak up and make that connection for them, what is being done right now is they're trying to manufacture consent for yet another regime change, for yet to save another proxy entity. So our unity is not a luxury, but it's a necessity. You know what I mean? It's a necessity at this point. Our speaking out is a necessity at this point. I think that the theme of the rally, the massive rally in Addis and Mescal Square, I think the theme was, I speak for Ethiopia. I speak for Ethiopia. You speak for Ethiopia, guys. I speak for Ethiopia. Hermela speaks. We all speak for Ethiopia. 120 million voices speak for Ethiopia. Not CNN, not Human Rights Watch, not the State Department. You do. And 120 million voices, and the million plus of us that are here in America, and there's millions of Ethiopians and Eritreans and Canada and the Western nations. Speak up everywhere. Speak up. Challenge every false narrative that's presented. Make it difficult for them to manufacture consent from their population here so they can execute their regime change operation.
Absolutely. And, I think that that's sort of, to me, one of the things that, the No More movement did well is give people the sense of, you have the right to say no more. What you're looking at is actually what you're looking at. There is a complete gaslighting of the facts in this conflict. There's no reason why there should be a debate about whether an armed group that picked up, arms and killed National Army Defense Forces should have equal standing, let alone have an upper standing or a higher standing on the international stage. There's nothing about that that should be acceptable. There's nothing about that that should be acceptable to any country, and even African countries. We should be able to say, we are going to live up to the standards that everybody else are supposed to live up to. Same with the United States. And so, one of the things in some meetings with certain diplomats that they've tried to kind of push us into having conversations about is, well, you do not think that the Ethiopian government did anything wrong. That's really none of our business. It's not my business. It's not the United States business. As an Ethiopian, I'm going to have something to say about that as one in the African diaspora. But I do not believe that the ambassadors here in Congress within reason, should be worried about, has the Ethiopian government done anything wrong? Has the United States government done anything wrong on any given issue? Absolutely. It is up to the people of the United States of America to decide what to do about that through elections and through holding their leaders accountable. And the same is true for Ethiopia. I think we have to feel very firm in that what we're asking for is not something special. We're asking for equal treatment. We're asking for the United States to be what it says it is, when right now it's operating in a very opposite fashion. But we're not the only ones, and we're not the first ones, and we probably won't be the last ones as a country and as natives of a country to see this kind of completely hypocritical behavior from United States foreign policy, from the EU foreign policy. We saw the high representatives from the European Union, Joseph Borrell, referred to those of us outside of Europe, wink, wink, Africa, as the jungle, and they the gardeners. And, the garden cannot build enough walls to keep the jungle out. So we have to go to the jungle. Like, what are we talking about? It is 2022. This is completely unacceptable, but I do appreciate when they get very explicit with what they're saying, so that we know what we're responding to. So to your point, everyone should feel like, look at what the pro TPLF activists do. They misuse their positions and work to feed into this propagandistic, ethno-fascist warmongering narrative. And so with the lie on their side, or with the propaganda, completely flipped upside down propaganda, which, by the way, and this is largely for folks outside of the Horn, hurts the people in Tigray most. It is the people in Tigray who are being denied humanitarian aid unless they give up their kids to go into war. We saw, I was able to confirm one video, but there are others, videos of these aid that was stored, U.S. aid, grain that was stored in facilities and was essentially locked up and hoarded by the TPLF insurgents while they were saying that Tigray was under siege. And it was some of that aid that the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and Ethiopian government officials actually gave out to the local people. And a lot of time in these videos, we don't see a lot of young people, at least people that would be, teenagers, or we might see little kids, but mostly elderly people. And so, and we know that's a population traditionally, that have multiple kids, or more than one or two kids per family. And so when you see all these elderly people by themselves, you wonder, where are their children? Whether it's their adult children or teenage children. I've spoken with some government sources that say, we're concerned. Like, we don't know where the young people are. We don't know if it's a matter of them not coming back from the war front. We suspect that's the case for a lot of them, but it is a little eerie to come into some of these areas and find that there's not a lot of young people that are there. So Tigray has paid the cost, even by the TPLF's numbers, although they're not the best at numbers, but even by their own admission, 300,000 plus people have been killed. They say civilians, but we know they've been warmongering. And just to be clear, nobody here, I think even in the comment section included, likes war. It is a TPLF who has called war, their game, and it is their game that we're unfortunately having to play into. But nobody else, or most people in the country, the last thing they wanted to do is go into an armed conflict, because they know that they were going to be paying the price. One thing I want to read from one of our comments, and this is in regards to the idea of some of the TPLF leadership going into exile. Kifla says, if they're allowed to exile, then make sure that they will with a well, or they don't with a well-coordinated Western support, drive war into Ethiopia from Egypt and Sudan. Is that something that you've thought of, that if they're allowed to go abroad, that they'll continue to try to fight their insurgency against Ethiopia and Eritrea?
Yeah. Definitely. That's a concern. But I think the TPLF leaders going into exile, such a negotiation must also include the total disarmament of the rank and files, right? So, um, you know, how much would they be able to be successful without an army? Um, without, I think they have over 300,000 uh, rebel forces right now. But if that can be decimated, as in being disarmed, and no weapon in the area, that the risk would be minimal. But if I'm not mistaken, my understanding of a typical a negotiation that includes an exile of a party involves that exile comes with a condition, with some signatures of the host country, that person will no longer be involved in any politics that has to do with that country, and that going into exile means they become a private citizen. So I don't think that such a negotiation would include TPLF leaders just being relocated to some other country from where they can launch a war. It would have to include stipulations and checks and balances to ensure that the exile parties are going to just be ordinary citizens that will no longer that basically sign some kind of an agreement with a condition that they will no longer be involved with Ethiopia.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I want to bring up a couple of notices for people to be aware of. You did mention this already. Tomorrow, it's actually technically today. Actually, no, tomorrow. Um, okay, my days are getting mixed up. So I'm on the Pacific PST. So it is Saturday early morning here. On Sunday, October 23rd, there's going to be a rally in DC. You guys look out for the flyers. Do you know the time, Nebiyu?
It's at 2 p.m., Sunday, 2 p.m., in front of the White House.
Perfect. Yeah. So if you are in the DC area, if you know people in the DC area, high chance, considering it's a very big Ethiopian Eritrean community, please let them know to show up. This is as critical time as ever for the State Department, for those in Congress to see that the Ethiopian Eritrean diaspora continue to push back against the State Department's efforts to intervene in this war on behalf of the armed rebels. They're pressuring the government. I hear it's very intense, and in terms of how much pressure that they're putting on the government to be the one that somehow unilaterally comes up with peace when that is the party that has 3 times now declared unilateral peace. So if you're in the DMV area, the DC area, if you know people, please send them that information directly. Like Nebiyu said, it's 2 p.m. In front of the White House on Sunday, October 23rd. Also, a reminder that the midterms is it the midterms this time? Yeah,
Yes.
November 4th. Yes,
Yes.
yes. We've got 2 more years,
You got to
unfortunately,
vote. You got to
for
vote.
the general election. Yeah, the longest 4 years ever. Or well, I guess it's all relative, but it's another long 4 years. But yes, this is a midterms. It's the general midterm election. So please make sure you vote. APAC has a little bit of a cheat sheet for those that who don't know who to vote for where. It doesn't include, I don't know that it's completely comprehensive, but please reach out to people that you know, organizers that you know that are in your city. I know the California chapter has recommendations based on people's stance on Ethiopia, on who to vote for. So just please make sure you vote, though, and do a little bit of research, at least when it comes to those that are in the House and Senate. When you do vote, it's really important for us to show that we are there in numbers and that we are active civically. As we're approaching the 2-year anniversary of this conflict, hopefully the end of it sooner than later, but stay active. And is there anything, Nebi, that you want to talk about that the Ethiopian American Development Council is doing? I know you guys recently did a Pan-African event that brought together Native African/Americans. I know that category can be really wide, but essentially a Pan-African community to hear from some candidates. Can you talk a little bit about that and anything else that the Ethiopian American Development Council in Colorado is doing?
Yeah, really, it's about the midterm elections right now. But one of the things that we've always focused on is Pan-Africanism. Working across with our brothers and sisters from the African continent, from the Caribbean, because together we're stronger. This election season, really, if you're an American citizen, register to vote if you have not registered yet, and make sure that you vote. And the forum we did in Colorado really had over a dozen candidates that came in at a community event that was filled with Ethiopians, Eritreans, Nigerians, people from Sudan, Somalia. I mean, there was over people from over 20 different African countries, where candidates from both parties and independent parties that came in and really told us why we should vote for them, right? And they were asked questions, tough questions, and it was crystal clear that the people that came in person, most of them, did their research. They understood, and it was revealing that especially, I was quite surprised that the at least in Colorado, the people that from the Republican Party actually knew the situation very well in Ethiopia, and they are against the war, and they're against the sanctions. They're against this support to the TPLF, and that they spoke on that to their people, and that they made promises that they will stand with Ethiopia. They will. So that's the kind of things that I would encourage everybody to do everywhere you are. It doesn't happen overnight. It requires organizing. So organize, come together with your neighbors, with your people at everywhere, at your work, at your church, at your mosque, and get involved and be active in these elections, because it does make a difference. It does make a difference at the end of the day. These people that are elected are the ones that are making the policy decisions that affect our lives and that affect our families and that affects Africa as a whole. So I mean that's really it. Thank you, Hermela, for everything that you're doing. You're doing an amazing job. Just really carrying on the mantle, and thank you, everyone, for all the nice
Yeah.
things people are saying on the comments.
Very, yeah, it's such an incredible, comment section. I think people haven't seen me and you in a while. I'm not doing as much, on air as well, because a lot of community building is happening. I've been in DC and New York and Seattle, and we've talked a lot about how important it is to just meet with people in person and really get to know them and figure out what they're thinking and where we have consensus and how we can work together. And I think that's just a message that I don't think could be hammered in more. Like, get to know the people in your community, get to know the people in your city, get together. Like, pick up the phone, get together, find a hall, get together at somebody's house. We really need to plant the seeds for a more united Ethiopian, Eritrean, Horn of Africa, African diaspora, American. Like we're so many things in one, but we need to really rebuild our communities as diverse as they are, and rebuild what may have been lost in the last decades of war. Really, people having to leave their home in Ethiopia for different reasons, in many cases because of conflict, or at the very least because of lack of economic opportunities due to conflict, which often has, almost always actually has, external interference that is exacerbating it. So we have a lot to make up. This is, many of us we're not that deeply rooted in the community before. We found a lot of our new friends through the work that we're doing, and it's based on shared values and not ethnicity or even any sort of political group per se, but with the understanding that we are against this kind of ethnic division. We're against war. We're saying no more to exploitation through disinformation, division, and war. So we need to continue to build on that. So wherever you are, please make sure you're getting to know your community. Again, Sunday, October 23rd, at 2 p.m. in front of the White House, there is a rally. And also Monday, we're expecting South Africa time, we're expecting some peace talks to take place between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF. And, like we've talked about, there's been a lot of slandering and defaming and demonizing of the Ethiopian government in the lead up to this peace talks. So I don't know how well they're going to go. We hope for the best, but if there's any indication based on the way the TPLF and their enablers here in the West have been dealing with this, it's probably not going to come up with any results. But we remain hopeful that things will look differently than what they have before. And Monday morning, as the peace talks will have wrapped up, assuming they take place, 7:30 Pacific in the morning and 10:30 a.m. Eastern, I'll be joined by my Kenyan American journalist Karanja Gasheshe to talk about the peace talks. Maybe we'll get Nebiyu in here, but I might have used you up tonight. But if you're available, we'd love to get you in here and get some of the analysis on what happens there. But again, we wish the best. We wish for the best outcome, regardless of what we have seen in the last 2 years. Nebiyu, you're amazing for sticking with me. It's 12:30 a.m. where I am and an hour later where you are. So thank you for being a great sport and hopping on last minute. And I think it's just so much great insight. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Nebiyu Asfaw, co-founder of the Ethiopian American Development Council. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. We'll see you next time. We'll see you Monday, 7:30 a.m. Pacific, right here on youtube.com/Hermela TV. Good night.